The year was 1916. The war was raging across the ocean, and the world seemed to be tearing itself apart. Yet, in the high ridges of North Carolina's Appalachian mountains, time moved differently. The mountains stood like ancient sentinels, their misty crowns untouched by the turmoil of distant nations. The valleys below lay hushed beneath canopies of oak and pine, where the wind whispered through the hollows like a voice from another world. In Madison County, a few scattered families tended their farms and lived quiet, insulated lives. Roads were narrow, unpaved, and often swallowed by the forest. The nearest town was days away by horseback. It was a place that kept its own secrets and demanded its own silence. Among these ridges lived a man named Silas Ward. To most, he was barely more than a rumor, spoken of in lowered voices near the hearth or at the general store in Marshall. He lived alone, far beyond the reach of any neighbor, in a small cabin perched atop a ridge where fog lingered long after dawn. Some said he'd come from Tennessee. Others swore he was once a preacher who'd lost his mind. No one knew for sure. He came around town only a handful of times each year, just enough to buy salt, flour, and lamp oil before retreating again into the woods. Silas had the eyes of someone who listened more than he spoke. Gray, almost translucent like river glass. He moved with the quiet precision of a man who wanted the world to forget him. Children were warned not to wander near his land. Yet in the mountains, solitude wasn't so strange. Many men kept to themselves, and the locals knew better than to pry. The mountains could be cruel to those who didn't respect their ways. But in the late summer of 1915, strange things began to happen on the ridge where Silas lived. Farmers spoke of lights flickering between the trees, not lanterns or torches, but flashes that pulsed and faded like some distant storm trapped among the hills. At night, a low humming sound drifted down into the valleys, a sound not quite like singing and not quite like wind. Families began keeping their children indoors after sunset. Their prayers whispered with an unease they could not name. When the first person disappeared, no one imagined it could be connected. Sarah Holt was 17. The daughter of a shepherd who lived in the valley beneath the ridge. She went to fetch water from the stream one spring morning and never returned. Search parties scoured the woods for days. Not a footprint, not a piece of cloth, not a single sign of struggle was ever found. The forest had swallowed her whole. For weeks, the air in Madison County felt heavier. Mothers walked their children to the creek instead of sending them alone. Men kept rifles near the door, though no one said aloud what they feared. In a place as isolated as this, every sound, every breaking twig, sounded like an omen. And still the light on Silas Ward's ridge burned on. There were whispers in the general store, questions, passed from one man to another when the sheriff's name was mentioned. Why did Silas live so far from town? What did he do alone all those years? Why did no one ever see him at church? Sheriff Robert Clay, a man of solid reputation and unshakable calm, dismissed the rumors at first. The mountains bred superstition like mold on stone. But when a second disappearance followed just weeks later, a young hunter named Daniel Pierce who vanished without a trace, the sheriff began to listen. Clay rode the trail to Silas's cabin himself, accompanied by 2 deputies. The path was steep, winding through switchbacks of thick undergrowth and narrow ravines, where even sunlight seemed to hesitate. When they finally reached the clearing, Silas stood outside, splitting wood. His face bore no surprise at the sight of lawmen. His eyes, cold and unwavering, met the sheriff's like 2 mirrors reflecting nothing. The cabin was neat, almost obsessively so. Firewood stacked evenly, tools sharpened and hung in perfect alignment. Inside, a single bed, a table, and a shelf lined with books, some worn to the spine, titles faded beyond recognition. Everything spoke of a man who lived by order and ritual. Sheriff Clay asked if he'd seen or heard anything unusual. Silas shook his head. He said he'd been working his land, keeping to himself. When asked about the missing girl and the hunter, he showed no emotion, no flicker of curiosity or concern. Just a nod, polite and empty. As the sheriff turned to leave, he caught sight of something on the windowsill, a collection of small stones arranged in a pattern, circles within circles, marked by tiny scratches. At a glance, it could have been random, yet there was something deliberate about it, something ancient. Clay didn't mention it. He simply tipped his hat and led his men back down the mountain, though a weight settled in his chest that he couldn't shake. That night, as he sat in his office with a cup of whiskey, Clay stared into the lamplight and thought about those empty eyes, that perfect cabin, and the strange symbols etched in stone. Something about it all felt wrong, like a story that was missing its middle. The wind outside moaned through the pines, and for a moment it almost sounded like a human voice. Silence returned to the ridge, but peace did not. Sometimes the mountains keep their secrets, not out of malice, but because they know the world beyond wouldn't understand them. By the time spring turned to summer, the unease in Madison County had hardened into fear. The woods, once a source of food and solitude, began to feel like a living thing that watched from the shadows. Families spoke less openly of the missing. To name what haunted them felt like an invitation. Still, whispers spread through the valleys. That something old and hungry had awakened in those hills, and that Silas Ward had something to do with it. When Sheriff Clay returned to the ridge for a second visit, the air felt heavier. The trail was damp from rain, and fog clung low to the ground. He and his deputies moved quietly, their boots sinking into the soft earth. The closer they got, the quieter the forest became, until even the birds seemed to hold their breath. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked the same as before, smoke curling from the chimney in lazy gray threads. Silas was tending his small garden, pulling weeds with slow, deliberate movements. Clay dismounted and called out. Silas looked up, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, the sheriff broke the silence, asking if he owned any firearms. Silas nodded and went inside. He returned with an old rifle, clean and well-oiled, but clearly unused. Clay examined it, finding nothing remarkable. No fresh powder smell, no spent shells. Silas spoke little. His words came low and measured, as if each one carried weight. When asked whether he'd heard gunfire the day Daniel Pierce disappeared, Silas said only that the mountains were full of echoes, and not all of them belonged to men. Clay didn't like that answer, but he couldn't prove anything. He and his deputies left, but as they descended the trail, one of them swore he saw movement in the trees above, a flicker of lantern light where no path existed. The next morning, fog rolled in thicker than anyone could remember. It lingered for days, smothering the valleys in pale gray light. During that week, dogs howled through the nights, and cattle refused to graze near the forest edge. A sense of something unseen pressing closer began to seep into every home. Then a third person vanished. Her name was Emma Caldwell, a schoolteacher who lived near the foot of the ridge. She was respected, gentle, and known for walking to her small schoolhouse each morning no matter the weather. One day she simply didn't arrive. When her neighbors went to check, they found her front door ajar, a kettle still warm on the stove, and bread half cut on the table. Her coat hung by the door untouched. By now, fear was a living thing in Madison County. No one dared travel alone. Church attendance doubled overnight. The sheriff sent telegrams to Raleigh asking for help. And soon an investigator arrived, a man named Marcus Webb. He was from the city, his manner precise and deliberate, with eyes that missed nothing. He carried a leather notebook everywhere he went and wrote constantly, as if afraid his thoughts would vanish if he didn't trap them on paper. Webb studied the map of the region and traced the points where the 3 people had disappeared. A slow dread settled over him as he realized the pattern. Each disappearance formed a loose semicircle, all radiating outward from a single point, the ridge where Silas Ward's cabin stood. He showed the map to Sheriff Clay, who stared at it for a long moment before exhaling through his teeth. They both knew what it meant, but knowing and proving are two very different things. Webb proposed a discreet observation. Volunteers from nearby farms would take turns watching Silas's cabin from a distance, never too close, never revealing themselves. For 2 weeks they kept watch, recording every movement. Most nights were uneventful. Silas chopped wood, cooked his meals, read by lamplight. But on 3 occasions, something different happened. Just after midnight, he would emerge from the cabin carrying a lantern and disappear into the forest behind his property. The men watching from afar said the glow of his light moved deep into the trees, winding along no clear path until it vanished entirely. He would not return until near dawn. Webb found this detail troubling. He asked the watchers to describe the direction. When he plotted their reports on the map, all 3 paths converged toward the same. Hollow behind the ridge, a section of forest that locals called Dead Man's Hollow. though no one remembered why. It was a place avoided even before the disappearances, a place where compasses spun without direction and animals refused to dwell. When Webb asked old residents about that hollow, one gray-haired farmer crossed himself and said, "The mountain remembers what it's fed." Those words lingered in Webb's mind. 2 days later, under the pale light of early morning, he led a small group of men into those woods. The trail was faint, swallowed by undergrowth, but it existed, just enough to guide them upward. For an hour they climbed in silence until they came upon something strange. Carved into the trunks of old trees were symbols, crude but deliberate, runes or markings that didn't belong to any known alphabet. Some had been there for years, others looked freshly cut. The air felt colder there, as though the forest itself drew breath and exhaled frost. Following the line of carved trees, they reached a clearing. In its center stood a rough circle of stacked stones too symmetrical to be natural. Moss crept between them, and the ground around the structure was bare. No grass, no leaves, nothing living. Webb crouched and touched one of the stones. His fingers came away dark with dried stains that looked far too much like blood. For a long moment, no one spoke. The woods seemed to listen. Then Webb stood, his voice low and certain. "We're not dealing with superstition," he said. "We're standing in the middle of someone's ritual." The wind stirred the trees, and for a heartbeat, it sounded like a whisper, soft, distant, and full of sorrow. Sometimes horror doesn't arrive with screams or violence. It waits in silence, patient as stone, until someone finally dares to look closer. They returned at dusk, their faces pale beneath the weak lantern glow. No one spoke during the descent, not even the usually talkative Joseph Martin, the hunter who'd accompanied them. The forest felt wrong now, too alive, too watchful. When they reached the main road, Webb turned to Sheriff Clay and said quietly, "We'll go back tomorrow. Daylight, more men." Clay nodded. He didn't argue. There was something in Webb's eyes, an unease that mirrored his own. The next morning, the group doubled in size. They climbed again into the ridge, sunlight filtering through the trees in thin, ghostly shafts. When they reached the clearing, the stone structure looked different in daylight, less mystical, more methodical, like the work of someone following instructions too old to understand. Webb and Clay moved carefully, taking notes, marking the positions of each symbol. Then Joseph Martin noticed something half buried beneath the roots of a nearby tree. Bones. At first they seemed animal, small and pale, but there was something unmistakably human about their shape. A femur fragment, the curve of a rib, brittle and clean from years of exposure. The air thickened around them. Webb crouched, his expression unreadable, and whispered, "Bag everything." They worked in silence, collecting what they could. Then, beneath a patch of leaves, they found a torn piece of cloth, weathered, but patterned with small blue flowers. Sarah Holt's mother had sewn her dresses from cloth just like that. They didn't need confirmation to feel what they already knew. As they left the clearing, the forest seemed to close behind them. No birds sang. Not even the insects stirred. Webb felt an ache in his chest that wasn't fear, but something deeper, a heavy grief for what these mountains had hidden and what they had chosen to reveal. He thought about the way people vanish, how easily the earth reclaims what it takes, and how silence becomes its own kind of tomb. That night, the men gathered at the sheriff's office. The evidence lay on the desk, bones wrapped in cloth, sketches of the clearing, the symbols copied into Webb's notebook. Dr. Sutton, a young physician from Asheville, arrived to examine them. Under lamplight, he worked with steady hands, his brow furrowed. When he finished, he said softly, "The stains on those stones, blood, human most likely, and these bones, at least 3 different people." The words hung in the air like dust. Clay looked out the window into the night, his reflection ghosted in the glass. "That man up on the ridge," he said. "He's been alone too long." Webb didn't answer. He flipped through his notes, each page filled with neat handwriting, cross-referenced dates, distances, and sketches of symbols. The patterns made sense to him in a way he couldn't explain. There was order in the madness, a geometry of fear. He closed the book. "We'll speak to him again," he said finally. The next morning, Webb went alone. He wanted to look Silas Ward in the eye without the distraction of deputies or drawn guns. The air was warm, thick with the scent of pine and earth. As he climbed, he rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd keep his voice calm, how he'd measure the truth hiding in the spaces between Silas's words. When he reached the cabin, Silas was sharpening a blade, a long, narrow knife that caught the light with a faint shimmer. He looked up, eyes pale and unreadable, then gestured for Webb to sit. His manner was polite, but there was something in the way he moved, slow and deliberate, as if each gesture were part of a ritual only he understood. Webb introduced himself as a man interested in buying land, an outsider looking for quiet. Silas nodded, barely responding. They spoke of soil and rainfall, of the isolation of the ridge, until Webb mentioned the disappearances. The air seemed to change. Silas's sharpening slowed to a stop. He said the mountains had always been dangerous, that people got lost, that the woods had their own ways. Webb pressed further, asking about the woods behind the cabin, the strange markings on trees. Silas's eyes narrowed, his lips curling slightly in something between a smile and a warning. "There are things up here you don't speak of," he said. "Old things, older than the ridge. They don't like being noticed." For a moment, neither man spoke. The woods behind the cabin rustled softly, though there was no wind. Webb felt the hair on his neck rise. He thanked Silas for his time, forced a polite nod, and started down the trail. Halfway to the valley, he realized his shirt was soaked through with sweat. That evening, as he wrote his report by lamplight, Webb tried to record every word, every inflection. He didn't believe in curses, but something about Silas Ward's calm unnerved him. It wasn't guilt, it was belief. The kind of belief that doesn't waver even when confronted with horror. And belief, Webb thought, can be more dangerous than madness. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains. The storm came suddenly, hammering the roof, flooding the dirt roads and cutting off the valley. In the flicker of lightning, Webb imagined the ridge, the cabin, and the man who lived there, alone with his rituals, his symbols, and whatever voices he thought he heard in the trees. Rain can wash away many things, footprints, blood, even memory. But it cannot cleanse what has rooted itself in the earth. When the storm finally passed, the air carried a strange clarity, clean, sharp, and unsettling. The kind of stillness that comes after something violent, when the world pauses just long enough to listen for what might happen next. Down in the valley, rivers had swollen and bridges washed out. It was 3 days before Webb and Clay could return to the ridge. And by then, a sense of urgency had settled among them like fog. They climbed with 10 men this time, armed and silent. Each step sank into the mud. Each branch crackled like a warning. The forest had changed. The storm had stripped branches and left the ground littered with debris. When they reached Silas Ward's cabin, smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The garden was overgrown, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. Clay called out first. No reply. They approached the door, guns raised. It wasn't locked. Inside, the cabin was exactly as before, orderly, clean, untouched. Except for one thing. On the table lay a row of small stones arranged, in that same circular pattern the sheriff had noticed weeks earlier. But now at the center, something new had been added, a piece of bone no larger than a finger joint, resting in perfect symmetry. Dr. Sutton, who had come along, leaned close and exhaled sharply. "Human," he whispered. The men searched the cabin, the shed, the yard. Nothing. Not a trace of Silas Ward. But near the back of the property, where the forest began, they found footprints, barefoot impressions pressed deep into the soft soil, heading toward Dead Man's Hollow. Webb crouched over them, running his fingers through the mud. The prints were fresh. They followed. For hours they moved through the underbrush, guided by the faint path of those prints, and the occasional scrape of a foot against stone. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until only the sound of their breathing and the rhythmic drip of water from the trees remained. Then ahead, Joseph Martin stopped and raised his hand. There, through the mist, stood the mouth of a cave. It was low, framed by rocks slick with moss. At first they thought it was natural, but then they saw it, a crude wooden door set into the stone, half hidden by branches. Webb's voice was a whisper. "He's been here." The men hesitated, waiting for the sheriff's signal. Clay stepped forward, pushed the door, and it creaked open with a groan that echoed through the forest. The air that spilled out was cold and heavy, carrying the faint metallic scent of old blood. Lanterns were lit. Inside, the cave stretched farther than it seemed possible. The walls were rough, gouged with marks where tools had bitten into stone. Niches had been carved along the sides, each holding the remnants of oil lamps long burned out. But the ground, dear God, the ground was covered in bones. Piles of them, human, animal, indistinguishable in the dim light. Scattered among them were fragments of lives lost, buttons, a child's ribbon, a woman's comb, a rusted buckle. Webb's hand trembled as he lifted a small locket from the dirt. Inside, beneath the grime, was the faded photograph of a young woman smiling faintly at the camera. He closed it gently and slipped it into his pocket. Behind them, someone whispered a prayer. At the far end of the cave, they found something worse, a stone altar like the ones in the clearings, but larger. Stains darkened the surface, still damp in places. Symbols were carved deep into the walls around it, swirling lines and jagged curves that seemed to shift in the flickering lantern light. Clay leaned close to one, tracing its edge with his eyes. "These aren't letters," he muttered. "They're something else." Webb stepped closer. His voice was calm but low. He thought this meant something. He believed the mountain wanted something from him. A sudden sound froze them all, a faint scuff, like movement deeper in the tunnel. Guns lifted. Lanterns swung. Then from the darkness, a voice, a child's voice. It came soft and trembling. "Don't shoot, please." From the shadows stepped a boy no older than 12, his face pale, clothes torn, eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. He blinked at the light as if it burned him. Clay lowered his weapon first, his voice gentle. "Son, what's your name?" The boy hesitated, swallowing hard. "Timothy," he said finally. "I live here. I did? With the man." "The man," he meant Silas. The boy told his story haltingly, the words coming in fragments. He'd been lost in the mountains over a year ago. Silas had found him, promised to help him find his family, then kept him there. At first, he said, the man was kind, fed him, taught him to read from old books, showed him how to listen to the forest. But over time, everything changed. Silas began talking to things no one else could see, to shadows that moved even when the air was still. He spoke of voices in the mountains, of the hunger that lives beneath the stone. Timothy said Silas sometimes took people into the forest. They never came back. When he asked where they went, Silas told him the mountain required balance, and that balance demanded a price. By the time Timothy finished, Webb's hand was shaking around his notebook. The boy's voice had been soft, almost apologetic, as if he feared that even now, speaking of those things would wake them again. Webb turned to Clay. "We need to find him before nightfall." Clay nodded once. "If he's still human." Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance. The storm was returning, and somewhere in that endless forest, Silas Ward was still out there, listening to the same whispers that had driven him to feed the hunger that never died. Sometimes evil isn't born. It's inherited, passed down through the land itself, like a curse that refuses to rest. Rain began to fall again as they climbed out of the hollow, fat drops drumming against the trees like a steady heartbeat. The men moved quickly, their lanterns swinging in the gathering dark. Each step back toward the ridge seemed harder, as if the forest itself didn't want to let them go. When they finally reached open ground, lightning split the sky and illuminated the cabin for an instant. It stood there like a wound that would not heal. They gathered under the eaves, soaked, their breath showing white in the cold. The sheriff told everyone to stay close and watch the tree line. Webb went inside, dripping onto the floorboards, his lantern held high. The stones on the table were gone. Every one of them. He felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He turned back toward the door, but something outside stopped him. A sound, low and rhythmic, rising from the woods, a kind of humming. It carried over the rain, carried through the trees. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Clay shouted for the men to spread out, to form a line, but the sound was already moving away, deeper into the forest, as though leading them somewhere. Webb caught Clay's eye and said quietly, "He's drawing us in." Still they followed. The rain made the ground slick, and branches tore at their clothes. The humming grew louder, then fainter, weaving through the storm. They came to a narrow ravine lit by occasional flashes of lightning. The trail ended abruptly, dropping into a steep descent of mud and stone. And there, at the bottom, lay a body, Silas Ward. He was sprawled on his back, arms at his sides, face turned toward the open sky. His eyes were open, reflecting the lightning like pale glass. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Beside him lay a small glass vial half buried in mud. Webb picked it up and turned it in his hand. The liquid inside was gone, but the bitter smell of hemlock was unmistakable. Sutton knelt beside the body, checking for injuries. His voice was flat when he finally said, "Poison. He chose it." The men stood silent, the rain washing over them. It should have been an ending, but Webb felt no relief. Only questions. Why here? Why now? He looked around the ravine and saw something that made his breath catch. The stones. Those same small marked stones from the table, now arranged in a perfect circle around the body. It wasn't suicide, he thought. It was ceremony. The sheriff gave the order to take the body back to town. They wrapped Silas in a tarp and carried him down the mountain. The boy Timothy walking behind them, head bowed, rain streaming down his face. When they reached the valley, the thunder had faded, leaving only the soft hiss of rain. Webb watched the ridgeline disappear behind mist and wondered if it was truly over. But even as the days passed, the unease didn't leave. The bones collected from the cave were examined and confirmed human remains belonging to at least 4 people, maybe more. The personal items recovered matched the missing. It was enough to close the case. Newspapers from Asheville to Raleigh printed headlines about the hermit of Madison County. Reporters called it the worst case in local history, a tale of isolation turned to madness. Yet Webb couldn't stop thinking about the boy's words, the mountain's hunger, the rituals, the voices. He spent nights going through his notes, staring at the sketches of those carved symbols. They weren't random. There was repetition, symmetry. He sent copies to the state university, but no one recognized them. Some said they resembled runes from Northern Europe. Others said they were pure invention. The more he studied, the less certain he became that Silas had been entirely insane. There was method in his rituals, a logic that belonged to something older, something that had survived in whispers long before anyone had named these mountains. Weeks later, when the burial was over and the last of the journalists had left, Webb returned one final time to the ridge. The cabin still stood, but it felt different, emptier, almost hollow. He walked through the single room and stopped at the hearth. Someone had carved something new into the stone above the fire. It was the same symbol repeated on the trees, the one that marked the center of the circles. He reached out, tracing the groove with his fingertips. The stone was warm. He stepped back, heart thudding. The air inside the cabin was still, yet it seemed to hum faintly, like the echo of something beneath the surface. Webb left quickly, not looking back until he reached the edge of the clearing. As he turned, he thought he saw movement in the doorway, a flicker of light, like a lantern being carried through the dark. But when he blinked, it was gone. He said nothing about it in his report. Some things, he decided, are better left between a man and the mountains that made him. When the county finally ordered the cabin burned, the fire burned too fast. Locals swore it gave off a sound unlike any they'd heard before. Not a crackle, not a roar, but something that almost sounded like a human sigh. When the ashes cooled, the sheriff scattered them across the ridge. No one ever rebuilt there. For a time, peace returned. The valley thawed into spring and the river sang again. Children played in the fields, and people spoke less often of the past. But on still nights when fog rolled down from the ridge, some swore they could see a faint light flickering through the trees. It was always just far enough away to make you wonder if it was real. Sometimes evil ends with a death, and sometimes it simply changes its shape and waits for the next man willing to listen. Years passed, but the story of Silas Ward refused to stay buried. The forest had reclaimed his land. The cabin's ashes scattered, yet people still spoke his name in whispers. Hunters claimed to hear the faint sound of chanting drifting through the trees on cold nights. Travelers swore they'd seen a dim lantern glow moving along the ridge where no one lived. The sheriff called them ghost tales, born from fear and memory, but in Madison County, memory carried weight. Marcus Webb stayed on the case longer than duty required. The official reports were filed, the evidence cataloged, but he couldn't leave it behind. He began tracing Silas's life backward, searching for records, birth, marriage, service, anything that could explain who he'd been before. 1908. There was nothing. No family, no town, no trace of existence beyond the deed to that land. It was as if he had stepped out of the forest fully formed, already marked by whatever madness or curse had claimed him. Months later, a letter reached Webb from an old woman in Tennessee who claimed she'd once known a Samuel Ward, a blacksmith, who'd vanished after a head injury and a series of strange episodes. She said he'd talked about the voice in the mountains and how it had called to him, even hundreds of miles away. Webb read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper, until he felt certain Samuel and Silas were one and the same. A man shattered by trauma, drawn north by something he couldn't name. He kept the letter in his files and tried to move on. But the questions lingered, circling in his mind like vultures. What had Silas heard up there? What had he believed so fiercely that he'd killed for it, died for it? Timothy, the boy they rescued from the cave, never really left Webb's thoughts either. The boy had gone to live with his family in Tennessee, and Webb wrote occasionally to check on him. For years, the letters went unanswered. Then, in 1923, one arrived in Webb's mailbox. The handwriting was uneven but careful. Dear Mr. Webb, I still dream of the mountains sometimes. I hear him talking in the wind, calling for someone else. I think he found one. Please don't come back here. There was no return address. Webb folded the letter, placed it in a file marked Ward S., and locked it away. That night, as rain swept across Raleigh, he thought of the ridge, of the carved stones, of the circle around Silas's body. He wondered if the hunger the boy spoke of was still there, if it ever left. Years turned into decades. The world changed. Cars replaced horses, the war ended, then another began. Madison County modernized, paved its roads, built new schools. Most people forgot the name, Silas Ward. But those who lived near the old ridge still avoided it. They said the ground there never stayed dry. Even in summer, the soil remained dark and damp, as if the earth itself was still drinking. In 1925, a journalist named Robert Freeman came to Madison County, determined to write about the old case. He visited the archives, spoke with the remaining witnesses, even found Timothy, now a grown man, a carpenter with haunted eyes. Freeman's article in the Charlotte Observer rekindled public fascination. It spoke not just of murder, but of something deeper. A man driven by forces beyond reason. Perhaps the mountain itself was the accomplice, Freeman wrote, and Silas Ward its unwilling prophet. Webb read the article in silence. The phrasing unsettled him. He'd never told anyone about the warmth in the cabin stone or the flicker of light that vanished when he turned away. Still, the words felt too close to the truth. That winter, the ridge saw its first snow in years. A family hiking near the state preserve claimed to find a circle of stones under the drifts, identical to those from Webb's sketches. They left before dark. By the time rangers went to investigate, the circle was gone. People began to say the mountain rearranged itself when no one was watching. Webb retired a few years later, his hair gone white, his voice quieter but steady. He lectured on criminal psychology at the university, using the Ward case as an example of how isolation and belief can warp the mind. But he never showed his personal notes, never mentioned the things that didn't fit the logic of investigation. In private, he sometimes dreamt of that ridge, of the storm, the bones, the humming in the dark. When he woke, the sound still echoed faintly in his ears, like a memory the mind refuses to bury. Time washed over the mountains, smoothing everything it could. The valley filled with new families, new stories. Yet those who stayed long enough learned to listen when the wind changed. On quiet nights, when fog rolled low and the forest seemed to hold its breath, they said you could hear it again, that same strange rhythm. Silas once followed into the trees. Maybe it was only the sound of wind between rocks. Maybe not. Because some hungers, once awakened, do not sleep. They wait, patient as stone, silent as roots, until another lonely soul begins to listen. And the mountain, as always, keeps its promise. The autumn of 1916 settled slowly over Madison County, painting the ridges in rust and fire. The leaves burned crimson before falling, blanketing the forest floor in silence. Time moved like the river below, steady, cold, indifferent. The horror that had devoured the summer was fading into memory, though the valley still carried its scars. Fields were left untended. Families moved east toward towns with brighter lights and shorter shadows. The mountains seemed to breathe again, but every exhale came with a shiver. Sheriff Clay tried to convince himself it was over. The body had been found, the bones buried, and the last of the papers sent to Raleigh. The county was safe again, or so he told the few men who still came to ask questions at the station. But at night, when he lay awake listening to the wind drag across his roof, he'd remember the look in Marcus. Webb's eyes, that quiet certainty that nothing in those mountains ended cleanly. For Webb, the case hadn't closed. He'd returned to the city, his notebooks filed neatly among dozens of others, yet his thoughts remained tangled somewhere on that ridge. He found himself waking in the middle of the night with the sound of dripping, water in his ears. When he turned on the light, the room was dry, but the sound lingered. He began writing again, notes, letters, sketches of symbols from the stones. He told himself it was research, but deep down he knew he was trying to understand, something that didn't want to be understood. The more he revisited his field notes, the clearer the pattern became. The symbols, the rituals, the blood. It was all connected to rhythm and placement. Circles carved into trees at precise intervals, the clearings forming geometric paths when plotted on a map. Not random, not madness, but a map of devotion. Webb wondered if Silas had believed those designs held power, or if they were the shape of his unraveling mind. Late one night, Webb sat in his small study, oil lamp flickering, rain ticking against the window. The world outside was asleep, but he felt the familiar weight of eyes in the dark. He flipped open the small notebook he'd kept from the investigation, its pages yellowed with damp edges. Near the end, written in his own neat hand, he found a note he didn't remember writing. "The mountain doesn't forget its servants." He stared at the sentence for a long time. The ink was faint, but unmistakably his. When had he written it? Under what light? The thought made his stomach twist. He shut the book, but the words stayed with him long after the lamp had gone out. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office in Marshall, addressed to Clay in careful handwriting. It was from a farmer who lived a few miles from the ridge. He claimed his hunting dogs had gone missing one after another. When he followed their tracks, they led him toward the hollow near the old Ward property. "The ground there ain't right," the man wrote. "It hums like a beehive when you step on it." Clay read the letter twice before folding it into his coat. That evening, he saddled his horse and rode out alone. The ridge was cold, the wind sharp enough to sting his face. When he reached the hollow, he dismounted and listened. At first, only the sound of the forest answered him, the rustle of branches, the distant call of an owl. But then, faint and deep, he felt it more than heard it, a vibration underfoot. Low and constant, like a pulse in the ground, he crouched and placed his palm against the soil. It was warm. The next morning, Clay sent word to Webb. By the week's end, the investigator was back in Madison County, his coat heavier, his hair grayer, but his eyes alert as ever. The two men rode out together to the ridge, following the same trail that had led them months before. The land seemed changed, trees grown thicker, the air quieter. When they reached the hollow, Webb knelt beside the spot Clay had marked and pressed his hand to the earth. The warmth was faint now, but real. "It's moving," he said quietly. "Like something underneath." Clay shook his head. "You think it's the ground settling?" Webb didn't answer. He stared at the forest around them, the pattern of trees, the way the branches curved inward as though drawn to the same invisible point. "This was never about madness," he said finally. He thought he was feeding something. Maybe he was. They left before sunset. Neither spoke much on the ride back. But both carried the same thought they refused to say aloud. If the mountain had once taken its toll through Silas Ward, perhaps it wasn't finished yet. That night, Webb stayed at the small inn in town. Rain came again, tapping against the windows like fingers. He dreamed of the ridge, of standing once more before the cave, hearing the low hum from within. But in his dream, the voice that rose out of the darkness wasn't Silas's. It was his own, whispering words he couldn't remember when he woke. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands trembling, and looked out across the valley. The rain glistened against the distant mountains, silver under a flash of lightning. For a moment he thought he saw a faint flicker of light near the ridge, a moving glow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He told himself it was nothing more than imagination, the echo of too many sleepless nights. But deep down, he felt the truth pressing against his ribs like a slow heartbeat. Some stories don't end because they were never meant to. They wait for someone else to continue them. And sometimes the mountain chooses who that will be. The next morning broke with a pale, washed-out sun, the kind that never really warms the earth. Mist hung low across the valley, and the ridge lay hidden beneath it, like a memory the world didn't want to face again. Webb rose before dawn, his sleep fractured, his mind still echoing with fragments of the dream. The whispering cave, the rhythmic hum, and his own voice calling back. He felt hollowed out, as if part of him had been left up there years ago, and was only now starting to call him home. He joined Sheriff Clay for breakfast at the inn's small dining room. The fire burned weakly in the hearth, unable to cut the morning chill. Clay sat across from him, silent, staring into his coffee. For a while, neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that didn't feel like superstition. Finally, Clay set his cup down and said, "The ridge isn't done with us." Webb nodded slowly. "No," he said. "It isn't." They decided to make one more trip up before sealing the case for good, a final inspection, if only to quiet the doubts clawing at both of them. The air grew colder as they climbed, frost already forming on the brittle grass. Every sound seemed sharper, the creak of saddles, the crack of branches, the whisper of their breath. When they reached the clearing where Silas's cabin had once stood, the earth was bare, scarred by old fire. Nature had begun its slow reclamation, young pines sprouting. Between blackened stones, moss creeping over the remnants of the foundation. It might have been peaceful if not for the silence. There were no birds here, no wind through the leaves, only the still weight of something unseen. Webb crouched, brushing a layer of ash aside. Beneath it lay a single stone, unburned, marked with one of Silas's symbols. He lifted it, feeling the warmth pulse faintly through his fingers despite the cold. The pattern carved into its surface was deeper now. The grooves darkened as though the stone itself had been drinking in time. Clay watched him uneasily. "Leave it," he said. Webb turned the stone once more before placing it back. "He believed this place was alive," he murmured. Maybe he wasn't wrong. They walked to the ridge's edge where the valley opened wide below. The trees rippled like an ocean in the wind. From this height, Madison County looked small and harmless, the horrors of that summer reduced to dots of memory. Yet the deeper Webb looked, the more he sensed the same rhythm that had haunted him for years. The slow pulse beneath the soil, the invisible heartbeat of something vast and patient. Clay broke the silence. "We should go." But Webb didn't move. His eyes were fixed on a spot far below, where the forest thinned near a bend in the river. A small shape glinted faintly there, reflecting the weak sunlight. He took out his field glass. "There," he said. "Do you see it?" Clay followed his gaze and frowned. "Looks like a lantern." The light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by trees. They descended the ridge cautiously, each man wrapped in his own unease. The forest felt different on the way down, closer, denser, as if the trees themselves had shifted. Once or twice, Webb thought he heard the faint echo of a child's voice. It wasn't words, just a sound, like a hum threaded through the rustle of leaves. He didn't tell Clay. Some truths grow heavier when spoken aloud. When they reached the valley floor, they found tracks in the mud, small, barefoot impressions leading away from the riverbank toward the hills. Clay knelt to examine them. "Too small for a grown man," he muttered. Webb's pulse quickened. "A boy." Clay shot him a warning glance. "Don't start that again." But Webb didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the footprints disappearing into the trees. "He said the mountain always takes another," he whispered. "Maybe it already has." The sheriff stood, his jaw tight. "If someone's up there, we'll find them. But it ends today." They followed the trail for miles, through mud and fog, until the path gave way to stone. The prints stopped at a small rise where the ground was oddly bare, stripped of leaves and roots. Clay crouched, pressing his hand to the earth. "It's warm again," he said. Webb didn't respond. He was staring ahead, to a new pattern carved into the trunk of an old oak. Fresh cuts. Clean, deliberate. The same symbol, identical to the one on Silas's stones. He felt the air grow thick, pressing against his lungs. Somewhere deep in the forest, a low hum began, faint but growing. It came not from one place, but everywhere at once, surrounding them, seeping into the ground beneath their feet. Clay's hand went instinctively to his pistol, but Webb caught his arm. "No," he said softly. "It's not him." The hum deepened, vibrating through the soil like the breath of something enormous. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The forest fell utterly still. Clay exhaled shakily. "We're leaving, now." They didn't speak again until they reached the road. By then, the mist had begun to lift, and the ridge lay behind them, quiet, watching, waiting. Clay promised he'd return with men to mark off the area, maybe even fence it. But Webb said nothing. He knew no fence would hold what lived beneath that mountain. That night, back at the inn, Webb packed his notes and sealed them away for good. Before leaving, he wrote one final entry. "It does not sleep. It only waits, and those who hear it will not forget its song." He placed the notebook in the drawer of the inn's desk, left a small sum for the keeper, and caught the morning train east. He never returned to Madison County. But the ridge remained, and on some nights, when the fog crawls low through the trees and the air hums faintly with the pulse of the earth, the mountain still sings, and those who hear it never truly leave. By the time winter came to Madison County, the ridge was already forgotten by most. Snow draped over the valleys, muting every color and sound. The townspeople moved through, their days as though the horror had been nothing more than a fever dream. The newspapers no longer mentioned Silas Ward. The official reports had been filed away, locked in dusty cabinets where no one cared to look. But the mountain doesn't bury what it owns. It only hides it beneath silence until someone listens again. In February, a hunter named Lucas Brennan vanished. He was young, reckless, and fond of boasting that the ridge held no ghosts. His friends said he'd gone out alone one morning to track a wounded deer, following its trail up through the old Ward property. When he didn't return, they searched the next day. By evening, they found his rifle leaning against a tree, the barrel slick with frost. No prints in the snow. No sign of a struggle. Just the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from the ridge, though there hadn't been a cabin there for years. The news reached Webb weeks later in Raleigh. He was retired now, his days quiet, his hair white as the winter outside. But when he read the letter from Sheriff Clay, short, cautious, offering only facts, he felt the same old cold settle in his chest. That night, he dreamed again of the mountain. Not the cabin, not the cave. Just endless snow and the sound of footsteps moving just out of sight. He woke before dawn, sweat freezing on his skin. The first thing he saw was his notebook, the one he'd locked away at the inn years ago, sitting open on the desk across the room. The drawer he'd sealed it in was undisturbed, the key still around his neck. The last page, the one he remembered leaving blank, now bore a single line in his own handwriting. "The hunger remembers." He told no one. Meanwhile, in Madison County, winter began to thaw. When the snow melted, the river flooded its banks, washing debris from the ridge into the valley below. Among the driftwood and broken branches, a farmer found something strange, a small, perfectly round stone, carved with that same jagged symbol Webb had once traced in the dark. He threw it aside at first, but later, unable to shake the feeling that it pulsed faintly in his hand, he went back to fetch it. By morning, he was gone. The valley whispered again. Sheriff Clay, older now, weary, led one last search up the ridge. The forest had changed. New growth tangled the old paths, and the air felt thicker, almost damp with memory. They found no trace of the farmer, only a small circle of stones near the old foundation, newly arranged. Clay stood over it for a long time, his breath rising in white plumes. He knew the pattern well. When he finally turned away, he left his badge on one of the stones. "You win," he muttered. The sheriff died in his sleep that spring. News of his death reached Webb through a mutual acquaintance. The old investigator sat alone that night, staring at the fire, the crackle of wood sounding too much like the hum he'd once heard beneath the soil. He poured himself a drink, then another. But the warmth couldn't touch the chill creeping through him. The mountain had claimed another, he thought. and maybe it was calling for him next. He tried to write it all down, to make sense of it, to anchor it in the rational world, but the words came out jagged, splintered. He filled pages with half-formed thoughts, diagrams of circles, sketches of symbols. Somewhere between exhaustion and delirium, he began to hear it again. That faint rhythm pulsing under the silence, like something vast breathing through the bones of the earth. He pressed his palms against the desk, trying to steady himself, but the wood was trembling. The lamp flickered, and for a moment the room was dark. When the light steadied again, he saw the reflection in the glass, his own face, and behind it, a faint glow like a lantern moving through fog. Webb closed his eyes. "It's not real," he whispered. "It's memory." But memory, like hunger, doesn't fade. In the years that followed, the land where Silas Ward had lived was absorbed into a state forest. Rangers cleared the trails, built signs for tourists, and marked the ridge as part of a scenic overlook. No one spoke of what had come before. They said the past didn't matter anymore, but the old families knew better. They warned their children not to wander too far, not to follow strange lights, not to answer when the wind called their names. Sometimes, on nights when the mist crawled low and the moon hid behind clouds, hikers reported hearing faint music, a soft, wordless humming echoing through the trees. They said it came from nowhere and everywhere at once, that it stopped the moment you tried to listen too closely, and every few years, someone disappeared. The official reports blamed weather, accidents, wild animals. The locals didn't bother arguing. They just nodded and said, "The ridge takes what it's owed." Somewhere beneath those mountains, beneath a century of silence and soil, the hunger waits. Not sleeping, not dead, only listening. Because the mountain remembers, and it's always waiting for someone else to hear its song. 100 years have passed since the mountain last whispered Silas Ward's name. But in the Appalachian air, time is just another kind of fog, slow to rise, slower still to fade. The ridge still stands, unchanged and patient, its spine cutting the horizon like a scar that refuses to close. The forest has grown thick again, erasing the last traces of what was once called Ward's Hollow. Yet even now, when the sun sinks behind the pines and the air turns sharp, locals say the woods remember. Madison County has changed. Paved roads cut through the valleys where dirt trails once wound. Houses stand where there were once fields, their windows glowing amber against the night. Tourists come every autumn to photograph the leaves, to buy jars of honey and apple butter, to hike the state forest's quiet trails. They don't know that one of those trails winds close to where the cabin once stood. A wooden sign marks it as Ridge Point Loop, scenic overlook, 2.3 miles. The overlook offers a view so beautiful, it hurts. An endless sea of forest stretching toward the Blue Ridge, the river flashing like silver far below. Most visitors stop for a moment, take a picture, and move on. But sometimes when the wind comes from the north, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, people pause. Some say the air hums faintly there, like a faraway note struck on a broken string. Last fall, a group of hikers from Asheville reached that overlook just as dusk settled. They were laughing, filming the view on their phones, their voices loud enough to startle birds from the trees. Then one of them, a woman named Kate, noticed something odd at the edge of the clearing, a circle of stones half sunk in moss. 12 of them arranged perfectly as if someone had placed them there yesterday. "Probably kids," one of her friends said. "Local folklore stuff." But Kate couldn't stop staring. There were markings on the stones, faint grooves worn by age, carved in symbols that meant nothing but looked old enough to matter. She brushed the moss aside to take a closer look. For just an instant, she thought she felt warmth under her fingertips, a pulse, like the echo of a heartbeat deep below. That night, back in town, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the stones again, the strange geometry of them, the way the forest had gone utterly silent as she touched the ground inside the circle. Her friends had teased her about being cursed by the Appalachians, but laughter only covers fear when you're in daylight. In the dark, she kept hearing the low rhythm of something moving, slow and steady, just beneath the sound of her breath. 2 days later, she disappeared. The ranger station filed it as a lost hiker. Search teams combed the trails for a week, finding only her backpack near the overlook. its straps neatly folded as though someone had set it down with care. A camera was inside, battery dead, memory card full. Most of the photos were ordinary. Trees, sky, her friends laughing. But the final one was different. It was blurry, tilted, taken just before dark. It showed the clearing from a distance, the circle of stones faintly visible. And there at the edge of the frame stood a figure, half-shadowed, indistinct. A man, or the outline of one, facing the ridge. His hands were raised as if in prayer. When the image was enhanced by the local authorities, the details grew no clearer. But the shape of his face, pale and narrow, seemed familiar to one man who happened to see it printed in the Asheville Times. An elderly resident named Paul Henson, who'd grown up on stories of Silas Ward, looked at that photograph for a long time before folding the paper shut. "It's him," he said quietly. "It's the mountain's man." Of course, no one believed him. But after that photo was published, hikers began avoiding the ridge after dusk. Rangers started finding new circles of stones in places that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Each was carved with symbols that matched the ones Webb had drawn in his old notebooks, the same notebooks that still sat, locked in a university archive box, labeled Ward Case 1916. Every so often, a graduate student researching Appalachian folklore requests to see them. The handwriting is elegant, the ink faded. Between neat lines of observation and analysis, there are phrases that feel like something else entirely. Notes written not for science, but confession. One page reads, "The hum is deeper now. It moves through the bones of the hills. I've begun to understand what he heard." Another, "If the land is hungry, then it is only because we've forgotten how to feed it." Some scholars call it metaphor. Others call it madness. But every few years, someone new goes missing near the ridge. Sometimes it's a hiker. Sometimes a camper. Once a ranger. Always alone, always near dusk. And every time the ground is warm where their footprints end. The mountain doesn't hunt, it waits. It hums softly beneath the weight of the living, patient as stone, steady as time. It calls to the ones who listen too closely, the lonely, the curious, the broken, and when they answer, it folds them into silence. Because the curse that never died was never a curse at all. It was an invitation, and sooner or later someone always says yes. The first time Dr. Ellen Price saw the Ward file, it was by accident. She had been digging through the University of North Carolina's archival basement, a place where dust settled thicker than memory. When she opened a box labeled simply Case Studies, Rural Crime, 1900-1925, inside were the usual brittle papers and yellowed photographs. But one folder caught her eye. Handwritten across the front in black ink faded by time were the words, "The Ward Investigation, Confidential, 1916. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone who studied Appalachian folklore had. The story of Silas Ward, the hermit killer of Madison County, the man who spoke to the mountain and vanished into it. It was the kind of case students whispered about after lectures. Half true crime, half ghost story. But this folder wasn't legend. It was fact. Inside were Marcus Webb's original notes, still sharp and meticulous despite the years. His handwriting was neat, almost elegant, but the words themselves felt like they were written by a man, losing his grasp on something invisible. Ellen read for hours, flipping through sketches of symbols, field diagrams, maps of clearings, and transcribed interviews. Then, midway through one page, she found a line that stopped her breath. "I believe the hunger Silas spoke of was not madness. It is something older, buried beneath these mountains. It watches. It listens." She sat back, heart racing. Outside, the library lights flickered once, as if in response. For the next 3 weeks, Ellen could think of nothing else. She requested the full case archive, reading Webb's reports late into the night. She traced the symbols, compared them to Norse runes, native petroglyphs, even alchemical sigils. None matched. It was as if Silas, or whatever guided him, had invented an alphabet that only the land itself could read. Her colleagues teased her gently. "You're starting to sound like one of the ghost hunters," one said. But Ellen wasn't chasing ghosts. She was chasing a pattern, one that connected every strange disappearance. Near the ridge for the past century. When she plotted the locations on a map, her stomach turned. The points formed a semicircle, and at the center of that shape, precisely where it had been in 1916, was Ward's Ridge. That night, She dreamt of a cabin that no longer existed. She stood at its threshold, wind howling through broken boards, watching something shimmer faintly on the floor. A circle of stones, glowing with soft light. A whisper moved through the room, not quite a voice, not quite silence. "You came back," it said. When she woke, her hands smelled faintly of smoke and pine. By morning, she had decided, she would visit Madison County. The locals were polite but guarded. When she mentioned the Ward case, some turned away. Others warned her off with quiet kindness. "You don't want to go up there," said one old woman who ran a roadside cafe. "Nothing grows right on that ridge. It's better left alone. But curiosity is a hunger all its own." Ellen hiked up the trail that now bore the state's tourist sign, Ridge Point Loop. The forest was beautiful in that deceptive, endless way mountains can be. Golden light spilling through pine branches, wind sighing through moss. But as she climbed higher, the quiet thickened. No birds, no insects, just the steady rhythm of her heartbeat and the crunch of leaves underfoot. It took her 2 hours to reach the overlook. The view stretched forever, a sea of green and gold. For a moment, she forgot why she'd come. Then she saw it, the stones. They were smaller than she imagined, worn smooth by time, their carvings nearly swallowed by moss. She knelt beside one, brushing the surface with her fingers. The grooves were shallow but deliberate. She traced the pattern, whispering to herself the way scholars do when thoughts turn to instinct. And then under her palm, the earth exhaled. It was subtle, a shift, a hum, as if something far below had stirred. She froze, breath caught, listening. The hum grew stronger, vibrating through her hand, up her arm, into her chest. It wasn't sound. It was pulse. For an instant, she felt the mountain's heartbeat align with her own. Then it stopped. Ellen stumbled back, chest heaving, staring at the stones. The forest was utterly silent. Even the wind had gone still. She whispered Webb's words aloud without meaning to. "It watches. It listens." The moment she said it, something changed in the air. The shadows deepened, bending strangely around the circle. The hum returned, faint, rising, and beneath it, a whispering rhythm like breathing. She turned and ran. By the time she reached the trailhead, the hum had faded, replaced by the normal sounds of evening. Crickets, wind, the distant rush of the river. She forced herself to laugh, but her voice shook. It was just panic, she told herself. Panic and altitude. She was a scientist. But that night, in her motel room, she dreamt again. The cabin. The stones. The whisper. Only this time there was something else. A figure standing in the circle, half shadow, half light. When it lifted its face toward her, she saw eyes so clear they looked almost transparent. She woke with a gasp, her skin cold, her ears ringing. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:03 a.m. From outside, through the thin motel walls, came a sound she knew too well. Faint, rhythmic, almost like someone humming. She pressed her palms to her ears. The sound grew louder. It was coming from beneath the floor, and somewhere deep in the earth below her, the mountains stirred. For a moment she thought she heard it whisper her name. Ellen. The voice was neither male nor female, neither alive nor dead. It was the voice of the soil itself, and it was waking up. Ellen didn't sleep again that night. She sat in the corner of her motel room, knees pulled tight to her chest, the thin hum in the floorboards refusing to stop. Sometimes it faded. Sometimes it swelled until the walls trembled almost imperceptibly. She tried to speak, to tell herself it was nothing, but air moving through the pipes. But every time she opened her mouth, the sound changed as if it were listening. By dawn, the noise ceased. The air turned still again, heavy and exhausted, as if whatever had been stirring below had simply gone back to sleep. Ellen packed her things without showering, without even glancing in the mirror, afraid of what she might see reflected there. She drove to the local sheriff's office, the same brick building that had once held Robert Clay's desk. The new sheriff, a man named Barnes, broad-shouldered and sunburned, greeted her politely until she mentioned Ward's name. Then his smile faltered. "People still chase that story," he said finally. "They don't usually last long up there." "You a journalist?" "A historian," Ellen replied. "I study how legends start." He studied her for a long moment. "Sometimes legends don't start. They just keep going. He offered to show her what little the department still kept, a single folder, half empty, with photocopies of Webb's letters and Clay's reports. She flipped through them, recognizing lines she'd already read, until she reached one she hadn't seen before. A letter dated March 1917, written by Marcus Webb himself, apparently never mailed. "I feel it now," the letter said. "I hear it when the wind passes over the ridges, when the rivers run high. I think Silas was never alone. I think none of us are. The hunger is patient. It waits for someone who listens without disbelief. Someone like me." The signature was shaky, as though written by a hand fighting tremors. The page ended abruptly. No farewell, no closure. Ellen folded the copy into her notebook. "Do you know where he's buried?" she asked. The sheriff nodded toward the hills visible through his office window. "Clay and Webb are both up at the old county cemetery. Same plot row. Webb died in 1944. Stroke, they said. Quiet man. Kept to himself near the end." That afternoon, under a gray sky, Ellen found the graves. Clay's stone was simple, half sunk into the earth. Webb's was the same, small, unadorned. Moss had claimed most of the engraving, but she brushed it away carefully, tracing each letter with her fingertips. Beneath his name and dates, she found a single line etched faintly into the stone's base. "The mountain remembers." She froze. That phrase didn't appear in any official record. It was one of Webb's private notes, the one he'd written before vanishing, from his field reports. Someone must have added it later. Someone who knew. When she looked up, the ridge loomed distant but clear through the mist. She could feel it watching her. The same slow pulse she'd felt, beneath her hand at the clearing, now beating faintly under her feet. She wanted to walk away, to drive home, to forget. But she knew the story was pulling her in. That's what the mountain did. It called people who wanted to understand. That night she returned. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening, crickets, wind, the distant drip of water. But as she reached the clearing, everything fell silent again. The circle of stones gleamed faintly under the moonlight, like teeth. She knelt beside them and placed Webb's copied letter in the center. "I'm listening," she whispered. The air thickened. The hum returned, deeper this time, resonating in her bones. The ground trembled, just slightly, and the shadows between the trees began to shift. Not moving closer, just turning as though to face her. Something rose from the soil inside the circle. Not a figure. Not a ghost, but a distortion in the air, a place where the night bent around itself. The shape flickered like heat above a fire. Inside it, Ellen thought she saw faces, dozens of them. Layered, flickering, ancient and human. Silas, Webb, others, all staring back. The whisper came again, clearer now, carrying more than sound, carrying weight. "We listen. We remember. Will you feed us?" Her throat tightened. "What are you?" she managed. The air shivered, and a single voice rose above the others. Deep, patient, familiar. "We are what the mountain keeps. We are what it takes to stay alive." The hum built, rising until her vision blurred. Ellen fell to her knees, her hands pressed against the earth that now pulsed like a living thing. For a moment, she felt everything, the rivers, the stone, the centuries of footsteps and bones buried beneath. She felt Silas's madness, Webb's fascination, the mountain's eternal hunger, and somewhere in that storm of sensation, she understood. The land had never wanted worship or blood. It only wanted memory. It needed to be seen, to be remembered. When she opened her eyes, the night was quiet again. The circle was gone. The clearing was empty. Weeks later, hikers found her car parked at the trailhead, her motel room paid for through the month, her notes left neatly on the table. In her handwriting, on the final page of her journal, one line: "The mountain doesn't kill. It keeps." They never found her body. But sometimes, when fog rolls down from the ridge and the wind carries that soft, rhythmic hum through the valley, locals say there's a figure standing near the overlook, a woman with clear, glass-like eyes watching the forest breathe. And if you listen closely, just before the wind dies, you can hear her voice whisper through the pines. "I'm still listening." The hum always answers, and the mountain, as always, remembers.